It's very good to be with you all, and I do hope very much that whenever we're allowed out of our houses again, that I can make it to Prague, and nothing would give me greater pleasure. All of these issues are intertwined at the moment, aren't they? And the thing that strikes me is that several things that I've written about, not just in my latest book, In the Madness of Crowds, but in the book before that, The Strange Death of Europe, which you were kind enough to refer to. Many of the issues in that book are also swirling around in the global debate that's going on at the moment. In relation to the recent events of recent months, I'd make this observation first, which is that when the coronavirus first began, I was struck by the fact that the globe had a serious issue to contend with, a serious public health issue. And it seemed to me that it was extremely likely that identity politics movements and, let's say, the grievance cultures that have been rampaging in recent years would have to take a step back in that situation. That is, that when pretty much everybody in society had real grievances, not least being locked in our homes, or many people losing their jobs, and of course many people dying, or at least being very unwell, that with everyone contending with serious problems, frankly frivolous claims of not very significant problems would diminish. It would take a back seat. So when you have a public health issue, as we've had in recent months, it seemed to me that microaggressions, for instance, might be taken even less seriously than they should have been taken before that. So that was my presumption. And I said a number of times and wrote a number of times in the early weeks of the pandemic that it was my prediction that that there would be a wider societal intolerance for the most egregious and extreme claims of the identity politics movements. That is, people claiming that there was not enough, I don't know, awareness of non-binaryism and too much use of he, she pronouns and not of they, them ones. Those people might just have to pipe down for a bit, because the wider society just wouldn't be able to treat them with the sort of intense fear and respect that they had hitherto. But I also said that at the same time there might be a wider societal intolerance for those sorts of claims. The people making them would be likely to double down. And I think there was evidence early on that that was the case. And I'm thinking particularly of attempts that various groups, media groups and individuals were making to say, for instance, that coronavirus disproportionately targeted women. This was widely claimed on the left, from the Guardian to the New York Times. When the statistics then showed that actually men were disproportionately likely to die from coronavirus, these same people turned on a dime and said, well, the men might be doing the dying, but the women are doing the suffering in some wider sense. And I just noticed there wasn't very much tolerance for those arguments, just to again interpret absolutely everything through these sorts of prisms. But that was what was going on. There was a more widely shared attempt to racialize the virus. In Britain and in America in particular, we had this in people claiming that ethnic minorities were disproportionately likely to suffer from the virus. Now, as it happens, there are statistics that do confirm some of that, and there is an investigation in the UK, a government investigation into why that might be. What strikes me is that it seems obvious that there are quite a number of factors that might explain that. There are ones that do with underlying health conditions in ethnic minority communities, possibilities of larger rates of overweightness, of possible underlying genetic conditions, or there could be behavioral things. For instance, friends in New York anecdotally told me from the very beginning that some of the black areas uptown in New York, people were just not social distancing. And these would seem to me to all be, you know, interesting and important things to look at, to try to learn lessons from. What I was struck by was the fact that the people stressing this, the media and politicians stressing this, particularly in America, but in Britain as well, seemed to be implying that we couldn't even import a virus from China without using it against ethnic minorities and making it a racist virus against them. That was the underlying claim that you could read in any day's newspapers. So yes, the virus seems to me to be causing these people to embed basically the worldview that they'd been trying out. In some ways, that's not at all surprising, because if you see everything, I mean, everybody present I know knows this, but if you see everything through a single ideological prism, it doesn't actually matter what that ideological prism is. Once you see everything through a specific ideological prism, any evidence that comes up that might contradict it is simply something you have to either ignore or somehow manipulate and push it into the ideological prism you have. So not many people outside the fields of expertise had been studying pandemics in recent years. This is an entirely new thing for most people to think about. And if you believe that our societies are only understandable through power structure dynamics, or through racial politics, or through, you know, male-female zero-sum game politicking, then you will continue trying to do that in this era as you did before. So all of this seemed to me to be going on. The thing that I thought was surprising was the moment at which that all took itself to a new level, and that is, as you just mentioned, with relation to events in Minnesota. I think that historians will have a very clear explanation for how this came about. It seems to me you cannot lock up the population for 3 months without there being significant blowout at some point. I think it could have been caused by any number of things, but what we saw was very interesting, because it's my view that in a country like Britain, for instance, the whole point of the lockdown was to protect the National Health Service. It turned out that anti-racism was even more important than the national religion that is the National Health Service in the UK. It had seemed to me that there was nothing more important in the UK than the NHS. But then we'd learned that actually there was something more important, so important that the government, police and others, which had been lambasting people for meeting more than 3 people in their garden only 24 hours before, suddenly allowed demonstrations of thousands of people very tightly packed together to congregate in major cities. And in the US, this was even more stark, of course. In the US, there were petitions of hundreds of medical professionals who signed open letters in the United States saying that, yes, we were in the midst of a pandemic, and ordinarily we would not advise that people congregate. However, racism is such a public health crisis that it trumps the pandemic, and therefore it's totally legitimate to gather in public places, squashed closely towards each other, and protest against racism. And throughout this, almost nobody seemed to point out that if ethnic minorities were indeed, for whatever reason, disproportionately likely to die of the COVID virus, it was unwise to then encourage ethnic minorities and others to congregate in large public places and so on. But the point is this showed that the underlying ethic of the era, the one that absolutely trumped everything, was anti-racism. I think, by the way, there's something which is been too little raised in all this, which is the extent to which we see in this, I mean, there's been a lot of talk of globalization in the era of the pandemic. I think one of the least talked about aspects of globalization, which I find most interesting, has been highlighted in this, which is the way in which globalization allows one country's culture wars to spread out and metastasize in no time across the globe. So how is it that the death of a black man in Minnesota at the hands, knee of a cop, can lead to, within days, people standing outside Downing Street in London hurling abuse and missiles at the British police? How is it that within a week, this event in America, this tragic event in America, turns into a war on statues, leads to a mob in Bristol pulling down a 19th century statue to an 18th century slave trader and philanthropist? How is it that by now, last night, there's another attack on a statue of George Washington in America that's pulled down? How is it that it's led to the disappearance of an episode of the comedy Fawlty Towers, or the inserting of trigger warnings on movie after movie, book after book? I think this is a really fascinating question, and I think that one of the problems that we're going through is that an interpretation of racial politics in America is being used to overlay very inaccurately, and I think unjustly, a specific American issue onto every other culture in the West. I think it's enormously unproductive, and I'm struck by the fact, maybe this is a very long answer to your question, but there's a lot to say on it. I'm struck by one other thing in particular on this, which is the seeming inability of politicians and others, almost everybody in the public square, to make any stand against the stampede that is currently occurring. So it seems to me rather surprising that a group like Black Lives Matter can get as far as they've currently got, almost unopposed. Now, of course, there are some built-in reasons for that. One of the built-in reasons is that people find it incredibly hard to oppose organizations whose very name is chosen in order to be non-oppositional. And what I mean by that is that we get somewhere near the territory we were in with the word multiculturalism. One of my critiques of the term multiculturalism was always, it was set up to be unopposable. I mean, there are no people who declare themselves to be uniculturalists or monoculturalists. And so multiculturalism seemed to be almost impossible to oppose, because it could mean so many things, but it had no thing that was in opposition, that was in opposition to it. I think we're in very similar terrain with Black Lives Matter, because they talk as if there is some large entity or grouping of society that goes around saying Black lives don't matter. And there isn't. They are a non-opposed force to that extent. And that's very clever, of course, because you make an enormous land grab at that point. And that's what Black Lives Matter has done. They've, with an unopposable name, they've made a land grab that is huge. A group that states in its founding principles that it is dedicated not just to the eradication of what it calls white supremacy, but the eradication of capitalism, for instance. Now, I don't think that a group that says, and also to all state structures. Now, a group that is opposed to all state structures and wants to dismantle all state structures and wants to dismantle the capitalist economy is obviously a very far left radical group who should be opposed. But what do we see in recent days? We see corporation after corporation paying their basically jizya to Black Lives Matter, promising to donate to them, huge sums of money being donated. to this, I think, very questionable group and a very questionable cause. What I think is happening is that people are deeply fearful of saying that they are opposed to this group, because the first thing that happens is people say you must be opposed to the idea that Black Lives Matter, therefore you must be against Black Lives, for obviously you're a racist. And it's extraordinary what a successful move this has been. But I think that it requires sensible people of any political persuasion to say, no, we need to find the brakes on this thing. A terrible, horrible killing of a man in Minnesota does not allow cultural Marxists and revolutionaries to dictate our history or do this very strange, highly retributive attack on basically everything that got us here. So I think there will be a pushback, but it's been almost silent in my country and indeed in America, I think.
We will make America great again.